Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Pecan Street's Race and Energy webinar. We're going to give everyone just a minute or two to join, and then we'll go ahead and kick things off. So sit tight for just 1 minute, and then we'll get started.
Hey, Clayton.
Yeah.
Are we automatically muted as panelists when we're not talking, or should we mute?
No, you're not muted.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to make sure that I have access to the share screen.
Yes, you should be able to.
Yeah, when we get to you, we can switch the share.
Can we, do you want to, oh, it already started.
Okay, that's right, yeah.
Okay. Hey, John.
Yes.
Are you able to angle your screen at all, or is it a?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Hello, Diana. How are you?
Hello, how are you? I have a.
Hi, John.
People hear us or no?
Yeah, we just started.
Oh, okay, got it. Otherwise, I was gonna chit chat. But...
So are we turning off the videos or?
Yeah, so I think what we can do is we'll just have the video on for whoever's speaking. So we've got Suzanne up first. So if John and Diana, if you want to go ahead and just turn your video off for now, then you can turn it back on when it's your turn to speak.
Okay.
Thanks. And I think with that, we've given everyone a couple minutes to join. So we can go ahead and get started. And to kick it off, I'm going to hand it over to Pecan Street CEO, Suzanne Russo.
Thanks, Clayton. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on race and energy. As Clayton said, I'm Suzanne Russo. I'm the CEO here at Pecan Street, Inc. Just some quick housekeeping items as we get started. All of the participants are on mute, but we do want to hear your comments and questions throughout the discussion. So to share those with us, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll pause periodically to address as many of your questions as we can. So we're here today to start a conversation about the nexus of race and energy with the intention of developing more awareness and more effective approaches within our industry to undoing racism and its impacts across communities of color. And we're including within the energy industry, the clean energy and the climate change movements. Here at Pecan Street, this is an issue we've been focused on for the past couple of years. Our research and our theory of change is grounded in putting communities at the center of developing solutions and new technologies and policies for climate change. We do this through the development of data and unique insights from the homes that participate with us, which are about 1,000 homes across the country. And then we're able to share that data once it's anonymized with researchers and companies around the world. Within our own work, as well as within the clean energy industry in general, we've seen a lack of engagement and participation with communities of color in doing this work. And so we're excited today to be able to bring together this amazing group of panelists to help us begin to develop a better understanding of how race informs access to energy, how it informs energy affordability, how it informs opportunities to participate in the new markets that are being developed around clean energy services, and how we can develop programs for more equitable outcomes across the spectrum of energy opportunities. So it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome today the speakers that we have. First, we have Dr. Diana Hernández, who's Assistant Professor of Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University. We are also pleased to welcome John Hall, the Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs at Environmental Defense Fund here in Austin. John has a long history of working in the clean energy sector here in Texas, and we're thrilled that he's going to be able to share a lot of his insights, as well as his perspective on how we can seize this current opportunity with this national dialogue around race to create more effective change. Dana Harmon is Executive Director of the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, also based here in Austin. Under Dana's leadership, TEPRI has become a national model for how we think about designing energy programs that more effectively and more equitably serve low-income communities. And she's going to talk particularly about the research that TEPRI's carried out over the past year that underscores the impact of looking not only at income, but at race when we design new programs. And finally, my colleague, Fisayo Fadelu, who is Pecan Street's General Counsel and CFO, is joining us. Fisayo holds a Master of Sustainability from Harvard University, and in addition to her leadership here at Pecan Street, she's also a well-respected advocate for social and racial justice issues here in Austin. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hernández at this point to provide a general introduction on this broad topic and share some of her research and her insights as well. Dr. Hernández, thank you for joining us.
I'm really happy to be here and always excited to share a panel with Dana Harmon, and also I'm grateful for Pecan Street for hosting. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides that are on this topic. And just in terms of just kind of getting things straight, I wanted to just start with level setting discussion on terms. And I've been working on the concept of energy insecurity and kind of building it up as an area of research and study to better appreciate the inability to adequately meet household energy needs. My own research has basically found that there are 3 dimensions to energy insecurity: that of kind of economic hardship, sometimes otherwise known as energy burden, physical dimensions of housing, so inefficiencies, but also behavioral components like coping strategies. The Energy Information Administration, based on the 2015 Residential Energy Consumption Survey, found that 1 in 3 households in the US are energy insecure. And they measure that as households that are foregoing basic necessities, that are receiving a disconnection notice, or keeping their homes at an unhealthy temperature. And one of the things that they found is that energy insecurity is patterned by vulnerability, that of income, household status, so having children in the household, older homes, and African Americans and Latinos are also disproportionately impacted by energy insecurity. In some earlier work that we had done using the American Community Survey, we found that in the green bars, African Americans across the economic spectrum were much more likely to be energy burdened than other groups, even as they were further and further away from the poverty line. And just recently, there was a paper, this is kind of a concept paper out of the Haas Institute at Berkeley, that's showing a racial gap in residential energy expenditures, also kind of demonstrating that African American households are paying more for utility services nationally. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time just thinking about what explains racial disparities in energy insecurity. And there are 4 kind of mechanisms that I see as accounting for these disparities. And that's disproportionate residence in energy inefficient housing that's rooted in racial residential segregation. And that basically means that as the red lines were drawn in the US, kind of mapping out neighborhoods where African Americans and other minorities could live and would not be invested in and still live because of the legacy of segregation in this country. It's made it so that the properties in these environments and in these neighborhoods haven't been improved. And so they are operating on older, less efficient energy systems and insulation, windows, etc. You also have the second explanation, which is that of a disproportionate energy burden. And some of that is rooted in higher energy costs, but also in lower wages and lower household income in general. You also have disproportionate disconnections. We have a paper that's currently under review that shows that African-American households are disproportionately impacted by a disconnection notice and the threat of disconnection and the experience of disconnections. And also I'd like to offer up the idea that this is also rooted in the delayed transition to cleaner and more efficient energy technologies. I'm currently writing a book about energy insecurity in the United States, and I had traveled to all of these different places. And so very briefly, I'll go over some stories that personalize and humanize the experience of energy insecurity in the US. And it happens to be that many of the people that I interviewed, I found them, or I recruited them at low-income home energy assistance program offices or community action agencies. This is an example of a woman who I met here in New York City. And as she was going over the inventory of issues related to housing, many of them related to household energy, she was just like, wow, this sounds so bad. And she recognized that besides the rent, the energy bill was one of the highest bills that she had to pay. And also considered, the importance and the safety hazards of an electrical system that was outdated. And this is Patrick, who I also met here in New York City. And basically, he was living in a studio apartment that wasn't heated. And so he turned to his stove and oven for heat and would wake up feeling nauseous and concerned about carbon monoxide risk. And then was also depressed as a result. So it's not just that energy issues as they correspond with race and income is the problem in and of itself, is that it also kind of invites new issues, including those related to health. And this is Miss May, who I met in Alabama, who basically was writing a letter to her utility company, basically making a case that in the over 45 years that she lived in this house, the bills had never been that high. This was a case of Linda Daniels, who died in almost 2 years ago in New Jersey during a heat wave due to unpaid bills. And her story is one of many stories of the disproportionate impact of disconnections and also medical vulnerability. So she was relying on an oxygen tank, and when she was shut off, she lost her life. Also the idea that solar and other renewables, there are many barriers for African Americans in this country in particular, but Latinos as well and other low-income groups to benefit from the clean energy transition, and as a result are paying more and are also benefiting less from new energy technologies. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions later on, but I wanted to kind of give some framing to why this was, especially important to think about from a racial justice lens.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hernandez. That was a really helpful overview. And I have a question for you. As a researcher, what are you seeing around representation adequately of Black and Brown communities and informing the development of energy policies?
I mean, energy policy is a space that I'm an academic researcher. Fortunately, some of my work ends up being used for the purposes of policy. But I'll give you an example of what I know to be an anomaly. So the Utility Reform Network in California actually just won a major campaign called Power at Home. And it reduced the number of disconnections and other fees associated with disconnections, and also just, kind of greater consumer protections. TURN happens to be an organization run by Mark Toney, who is African American, and most of the people on that campaign were people of color. That is a very, very, very unique, and I have to say, not the norm for the ways that energy policy is, is won and created. The NAACP has also been kind of active in shaping policy, but they're really, exceptions to the rule for the most part.
And as we do think about constructing policies or programs, or just providing information to decision makers that really has the intention of undoing racism within the energy sector, do you have thoughts about whether or not we have the information that we need right now to even understand how to do that, how to undo racism within the energy sector and the consequences of that historic racism, and what that information should look like, or how that information should be gathered differently perhaps than it is now?
So I have to say, one of the things that plagues the energy industry is the lack of transparency in data. So, if we just use the analogy of police, and here in New York City, one of the things that has happened in a quest for racial justice in policing is to make more available and transparent the disciplinary records of police officers, so that we can see whether or not there's a pattern in their behavior. And that's very difficult to do in the context of utilities, because the data isn't opened, right? It's not available for people to be able to identify whether or not, households, we might be able to surmise to some extent based on zip code, for instance, but that information isn't mandated to be available and isn't at the hands of people like me and other researchers that would be able to make those inferences. And I think that that's a major challenge, that to the extent that, there's obscurity and a lack of transparency and a lack of availability in terms of data, that we'll never really be able to identify the disproportionate impact by race and place and socioeconomic status as would be necessary to make that first step.
Okay, that's really helpful. So even just some PUC mandates or policies that require that data to be shared from utilities.
When the utility companies aren't necessarily collecting, data based on race, right? So, we would probably, need to account for that in these other ways, weighting based on the proportion of, let's say, the racial distribution in certain areas. But that might also be another ask, is to have the utility companies be more responsive to, collecting data on the race, ethnicity of their customers, as well as better data on income, because that's one of the ways in which they also kind of do away with their responsibilities around addressing energy burden, is to say that they don't have accurate data on income.
Okay. And just one question for you from the audience. Do you have a sense of why there are disproportionate disconnections for racialized communities?
Well, like I stated before, some of it has to do with, higher energy costs. But I think really fundamentally, it's about lower incomes. So to the extent that poverty is so closely tied to race in the United States, you have a group of a population in different jurisdictions that is, plagued by low wages and, uncertain, income based on, kind of fluctuations in hours and things like that, higher unemployment. So many different factors that make the income piece of this equation lower for African Americans, thereby the trade-offs and the tensions between meeting basic needs and having to put some issues like food and housing before utilities, and a very careful coping that is done at the household level, I think explains a lot of the disproportionality and disconnections.
Okay, thank you. That was all very helpful. We have a lot of other questions that have been submitted for you, but I think those will be good ones for the whole panel to cover. So we'll have John Hall speak next. As I mentioned before, John runs legislative and regulatory affairs for EDF here in Austin, but he also has a lot of great historical and policy context on this issue that he's going to share with us, as well as thoughts on current opportunities for change. So John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate the opportunity.
Love John. He's so sweet.
Let me begin with this. Race has been and is the most dominant issue in American politics. My hope, and I'm hoping that most of us will embrace the will embrace the movement created by George Floyd's unfortunate death to move us forward in this country to address this issue effectively and hopefully eradicate it once and for all. But because racism is such a dominant force within our society, coupled with the fact that we have not overcome it, has given rise to systemic racism. And systemic racism exists in the US, throughout this country, in every sector, and every organization. And unless and until a sector or an organization undertakes deliberate efforts or strategies to address systemic racism, it cannot free itself of its negative and painful impacts. The manifestation of a company or a sector coming to grips with the fact that it should and it has a responsibility to address this societal ill commonly manifests itself first in an organization's development and implementation of diversity, equity, and inclusion plans that typically relates to their employees, but eventually move to include its contracting opportunities from suppliers and the work that it does, or the products that it produces. Overall, the energy sector, including the fossil fuel component, as well as the emerging clean energy sector that many of us are spending significant amount of time to grow, have not undertaken, have not implemented diversity, equity, and inclusion plans. And as a consequence, have not afforded communities of color the opportunity to participate in the full benefits that they provide. Although these same communities are challenged to absorb or to experience the negatives of their operations. Available housing, for example, for minority communities, low-income communities, and industrial communities tend to be the ones located next to the facilities that generate energy or uses significant quantities of energy, and they are subjected to the dangerous emissions that come from those facilities. And if they have not undertaken, and I believe most have not, if they have not undertaken concrete efforts to ensure equity, inclusion, diversity in their workforces, that means that minorities are underrepresented in their employment. And to the extent they may have made progress, it may be in the professional sector or the jobs, the office jobs, where the engineers, the managers work. But most of the jobs, for example, will be those blue collar jobs that are great jobs in that someone without a high school, without a college degree can make $100,000 a year. But it's the case for sure with the fossil fuel industry. And I am concerned the same trend is developing in the clean energy sector. Politics or political engagement is perhaps the best near-term strategy we have to begin to rectify these challenges that have existed in many years. In Texas, because of our politics, the best opportunities may be at the local level, and let me try to explain. Sylvester Cherney is the mayor of Houston. Houston is known as the energy capital of the world. Sylvester Cherney has taken concrete actions to grow clean energy in this state. The city of Houston now procures enough clean energy to fuel its buildings and operations. The mayor has also made a commitment to electrify the city's fleet. His engagement on this issue, let me back up. There are tremendous opportunities by our city to, if it is in the business of procuring clean energy and fostering the growth of electric vehicles, there are tremendous jobs associated with these industries. And if Mayor Turner was educated, and I said it in a positive manner, because this energy is so technical, and you really have got to roll up your sleeves to begin to understand the benefits and the opportunities that it can provide. If those of us who work in this sector, in environmental advocacy organizations or in think tanks, if we would take the time to share with the mayor the significant opportunities he has as he works in this space, he can actually utilize his political influence to leverage the clean energy industry to not go down the road and make the same mistakes to make the same mistakes that other parts of the energy sector have made over the years. If we don't correct that, if he doesn't take the lead in helping to correct that with our full support, I'm concerned that even in the clean energy space, which offers the amazing opportunities for us to save large quantities of water, to reduce air pollution and climate pollution, we will see it develop as well as an industry that does not afford the same opportunities to people of color and low-income communities as it does the larger population. And I will close this part of my remarks by saying this. My children who are in their 30s and their friends who are in their 20s are not going to be as patient as my generation has been. And so the well-being of all of us is dependent upon people of goodwill across all economic sectors moving forward to address these issues across all sectors. Because if that does not happen, I am concerned that we will see lots of unrest, again, because young Hispanics and young African Americans will not endure the racism that my generation has endured. So each of our well-being and success and quality of life is dependent upon how well we move forward to address these issues that has plagued this country for 400 years. And if we do not move forward, I wonder if we will be here 100 years from now. And I'll pause there and ask any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, John. As always, it's very helpful insights. I'm curious, going with the Houston example that you gave, working with Mayor Turner, what would you be looking for from him over the next 6 to 12 months as signs of progress, as signs that things are being done differently, that he's taking the issue of racism seriously, specifically within the energy sector, and looking to do it differently?
Well, let me start with the police department first, and then move to energy. Mayor Turner and the City Council of Houston oversees the Houston Police Department, and all of the reforms being discussed at the federal level. The mayor and the city council can enact local ordinances to put those reforms in the near term. And fortunately, the mayor has actually set up a citizen task force to identify the reforms that need to be enacted. So I'm optimistic that will occur. My job, I have a role to play in getting Mayor Turner to understand the significant benefits of clean energy. And hopefully we're going to start doing that this fall, basically sharing with them the data and the analyses that we have completed, which shows that a major city and a major county individually and collectively can come together. And if they choose to utilize clean energy and they harvest as much of that clean energy as they can by placing solar on their rooftops and on vacant lands, those would be local jobs. Maximizing energy efficiency activities, those would be local jobs. And they can generate those jobs through the energy they use, create the local jobs, increase community resiliency, and at the same time, contribute greatly to reducing health pollution and climate pollution. So it's not just Mayor Turner, it's those of us who have the luxury to sit in our offices every day and do the analysis and do the research and see the emerging applications of these technologies. Our job is to engage with the mayor in ways that make sense to him, share with him the opportunities that exist, and then roll up our sleeves and work with he and his team to develop that vision and move forward to put in place strategies to achieve that vision. So it's a matter of us working together with Mayor Turner and other local officials so that we can make sure that the opportunities that exist in the energy sector, particularly the growing clean energy sector, can actually be provided to his community, and both as an economic development strategy, a job creation strategy, and a strategy to reduce urban air pollution.
Great. And you've talked a couple of times about the importance of addressing particularly energy and racism and clean energy development locally. So to see progress on this topic at a national scale, you would hope, I'm going to infer, to see a lot of organizations popping up with this kind of approach that EDF is taking, really advocating at the city level specifically to develop programs and implement change. Is that how you see change rolling out across the country in this space?
There is a passage in Proverbs that says, where there is no vision, the people perish. That the challenge is for environmental advocacy organizations and think organizations is to work with local officials, businesses, to help them embrace a vision of what can become. And once they gain that vision, it is amazing. And once they gain that vision and they embrace that vision, it is amazing how technology can be harnessed to bring about amazing results. But it's not just Mayor Turner's job. It's not just the state legislature. It's all of us who work in this space coming together and recognizing that our job is just not to identify effective strategies that work for our usual goals to be fulfilled, it's challenging ourselves to take another mile to make sure that those programs, those opportunities are being pursued in a manner that provide benefits to communities of color. And if we can do that through our think tanks and our environmental advocacy organizations, connecting with those organizations that are in the business of advocating for social justice, economic justice, and for the benefit of low-income households, it's amazing what we can do. But it requires us to go beyond what we usually do before we declare success.
Right. It's really understanding that this is all a system, that it's not just an environmental issue. We don't have just housing issues. Everybody's got to work together with a common vision.
And if I may add another comment, and the comment is this: our job is not just to succeed in our body of work the way we would usually define it. I want to challenge every American to embrace the perspective that wherever they work, there is another job that their help is needed. And that is to make sure that the promise of opportunity and equality is provided to every person in this country. So I want to say to environmental defense funds, for example, you have a responsibility to engage, to change voter suppression laws, to change local police practices, and for the benefit of our Hispanic citizens, immigration reform needs to be one of your top priorities as well, not just cleaning up the environment. And I think we're at a place in this country where we need all Americans, and if not all, most, to make it their business to become anti-racist. And if we can get to that point, we can change this fact that racism has dominated our politics since we were created. And we began during the 1600s.
That's a powerful vision, John. Thank you for your time. We have many questions that have been submitted for you, but I want to make sure that the rest of our panelists are able to speak to today. But again, to the audience, we hope this is just the first in a series of discussions with these panelists. And we'll also submit any questions directly to them after the talk today that we're not able to cover. But John, thank you for taking leadership on this. That was a message I needed to hear. Okay, we're gonna switch over to Dana Harmon. Dana, I will let you take it away. You have some slides you're gonna show.
Yes, I do. Thank you. Thank you very much. Clayton, can you pull up the first slide, please? Thank you. Hello, everyone. And thank you to Pecan Street for hosting such an important discussion. And I'm truly honored and humbled to be a part of this conversation. As Suzanne and John and Diana have said, really, I think that this is just the beginning of a conversation, and a very important one that we all need to be having inside our organizations on a daily basis. And really, the goal, I believe, here is how can we build an ecosystem to undo systemic racism in our energy system and overall in our society, whether we are a member of a utility, an environmental justice organization, a research organization like TEPRI or Pecan Street, or wherever we sit in the world. I think this is also an important opportunity to lift up the good work of scholars, researchers like Diana Hernández, like Tony Reams at the University of Michigan, and others who have been doing this important work for a long time, and say, how can we translate those insights into practice that result in systemic change? So just very quickly about TEPRI. Together with our members, TEPRI is committed to inspiring lasting energy solutions for low-income Texans. We're a data-driven and nonpartisan research organization linking different perspectives from across the industry and across the state of Texas, prioritizing data integrity and objectivity. And our work evaluates energy and its relationships with housing, energy and its relationships with health, with education, and economic opportunity, which is what makes this conversation so important. Ultimately, our work is motivated by humanity and tempered by humility that poverty is complex and very personal. And because poverty and race are inextricably linked, energy poverty and race are as well. Next slide, please. As Diana mentioned, the energy economics literature, including TEPRI's, has focused largely on several dimensions, and especially income and increasingly geography. But now we're beginning to focus more importantly on race. Diana referenced this study as well, and I think it's a very important work that we should all pay attention to coming out of the Energy Institute at Berkeley, showing the race gap in energy expenditures. I think this work very clearly shows that the black line represents black households, the white line representing white households, or gray line representing white households, showing that even after we control for income, household size, home ownership, and city, Black people are paying more in energy expenses. Next slide, please. And really this work is building off of a large body of work that talks about the persistent effects of systemic racism and what that means, perhaps contributing to these higher energy expenditures that are being realized. The data shows that Black Americans have less wealth and are less likely to own homes, more likely to face high cost loans, pay higher property taxes, facing higher income volatility, and consumption that is more sensitive to income shocks. The author here argues that these differences result in potential barriers to living in higher quality and more energy efficient homes, or ability to make energy efficient upgrades. Next slide. Additionally, some good work coming from ACEEE, the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, shows that not just energy expenditures are higher, but energy cost burdens are higher. Energy cost burdens meaning the percent of household income that's being spent on energy. So here we are factoring in income. This work published by ACEEE in 2016 studied the major cities across the US and shows that African American and Latino households were had significantly higher energy burdens than the city median for energy burden, and that was consistent across regions in the country. The point in showing this work is that the problem is systemic and it's consistent across our society, and we need to find ways to address that. Next slide, please. This is especially important because people end up making trade-offs in terms of quality of life associated with high energy burdens. A recent study conducted by our organization showed that in Texas, the most significant trade-offs were for food and clothing as a result of unaffordable utility bills. Next slide. And importantly, this is even more important as a result of the current economic and health crisis being affected from COVID-19. We know that the current crisis has disproportionately impacted low-wage workers with lower educational attainment. And when we look at the distribution of educational attainment across the Texas workforce, we saw that about 1.5 million Texas households had been affected by unemployment related to the pandemic. We also know that about 850,000 of those households are served by the Texas retail electric market, who may be experiencing unemployment of at least one worker. Our analysis has shown that there's as much as an $80 million collective electric bill hardship as a result of those unemployment efforts. So in order to find solutions to address high energy burdens, we must better understand those communities that are most affected. Next slide. One concept that our organization has found helpful that's adapted from the Union of Concerned Scientists is principles of equitable program design. So as we come together and design programs to address high energy burdens and energy insecurity in our communities, it's important that we ensure representation, that communities, including racially diverse communities, are included and empowered in the design, that we find ways to promote economic growth through local development and local jobs. We do take into account the environmental aspects, advancing community goals to improve air quality and advance climate action plans. We are mindful of consumer protection, ways to help reduce electricity bills and protect customers from risk. And importantly, we continue to consider health outcomes as a result of program design and deployment. I also think it's incredibly important to talk about what each of us in our organizations are doing to address systemic racism. Here at TEPRI, a few of the actions that we're taking include undoing racism training for our staff, which includes implicit bias training for each of our activities. We're also evaluating our hiring practices to ensure that our staff and our team is representative of the communities that we serve. And that also goes to include the makeup of our board of directors. Currently, we evaluate our board of directors to ensure that we do have adequate representation of communities of color. Right now, that's standing right at 30% for our board. And then importantly, we think it's useful to talk about these actions. We know that we're just beginning a conversation. We're not doing enough, and we have a lot to learn. But I think it's conversations like this one hosted by Pecan Street that really help elevate this conversation and turn this discussion into action for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. As always, TEPRI's work is very clear and useful and impactful. And as you mentioned, I think the role that TEPRI plays is just critical in translating research into policy and to effective new programs. So we're really lucky in Texas that you guys have already been working on this topic of race and energy for a few years now. And hopefully the model and all of the groundwork you've laid about how to understand communities, how to better engage and meet the needs of communities can serve as a model for other areas that might just be starting to look at this. We have a bunch of questions for you too, but in the interest of time, I want to make sure we have the opportunity for Fisayo to speak as well. So I think I'm going to pause on questions if that's okay, and then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes to address more. But again, for the audience, we're getting so many wonderful questions. We're going to do our best to try to get those answered after the webinar, and also hopefully have future opportunity with this amazing group to do more of a dialogue as well with folks that sign on today. So thanks, Dana. I'm sure we'll hear from you again, and we'll move over to Fisayo.
All right, thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to the panelists. I will be, bringing the perspective of what can cities do in their policy making and their planning processes. And I'll just start off by saying that the status quo differs by city. So diversity and political leverage of people of color will vary from city to city. So I think approaches will differ, but all that notwithstanding, I think across the board, there are things that cities can concertedly do. And I'll begin with saying that I think it's very important to always start by acknowledging the pervasive legacy of segregation, of discrimination, and underinvestment in communities of color. I think it's important to acknowledge the adverse consequences, which are by design, that these consequences cut across several aspects of life, energy being just a subset. And in terms of infrastructure, it's important to acknowledge that the disadvantage is evident not only in physical infrastructure, but also in social infrastructure in terms of education and healthcare and economic mobility. And why do I say intentionally starting here is important? I think because it's important in order to fairly and seriously address the problems of inequality. I think we need to draw the baseline appropriately. That is, we need to reflect that the playing field is not even to start with. What that means then is that equal investment will not work because the playing field is not even. Equal investment will not work because the starting point is vastly different. So in approaching policy making and planning, cities have to start by conceding the beginning disadvantage in communities of color, and then using that as justification for prioritizing the needs in these communities and for investing more in the redesign of a more equitable society. So that's one. I think another important thing that cities should do is direct and consistent community engagement that is aimed at listening to the needs and to the pain points within communities of color. For example, what does improved quality of life mean to these people? What does it mean in their communities? What does it mean in their own terms? There's an African proverb that says the affected usually knows best. And so I think community engagement demonstrates respect and recognition for the community's values and for their interests. So for instance, in the context of energy, I think clean energy may not necessarily show up on the community's hierarchy of needs, where there are other more pressing immediate needs. But if we can validate the need, their stated need for affordable housing, then through that we know energy efficiency is one way to help lower total household living costs. If we can validate the community's need for economic development, we know that the city can, by that, create opportunities for clean energy job trainings, create opportunities for small and minority business owners, contracting opportunities for them, and also create opportunities for wealth creation in these communities. So all of this is to say that cities should prioritize the community's needs in their own words. Also, beyond listening, it's critical to follow through on promises and to do that in ways that the communities can recognize that their input is being validated. So this means that that planners and policymakers have to be intentional about including the community's perspectives all the way from design to implementation of the programs and the services that they intend to implement or that are slated to serve communities of color. Another thing I think cities can do in terms of infrastructure, when it comes to assessing the lack in communities of color, it's important to recognize that the physical and social infrastructure are inseparably intertwined. I think cities need to broaden the conversation beyond the physical systems like transportation, or communication, or energy infrastructure, or utility systems, some of the hard infrastructure that we talk about, to also include and prioritize healthcare, quality education, public safety, and other social services, because these are all interconnected and they make up the person whole. And so if there's one thing that we can learn from the ongoing COVID crisis, I think it's that racial inequalities are far-reaching. So if the goal is to equalize outcomes, I think city leaders have to be strongly averse to inequity and be highly motivated to make financial investments in communities of color, as well as proactively and be open to leveraging their power with private industry to correct some of these racial disparities. So overall, I think those are my thoughts in general about what cities can do to use policy and planning to correct some of the racial disparities that we see. And I'll leave it up for questions.
Thank you, Fisayo. That was very helpful and rational discussion of how cities need to reframe these issues. So we have a few minutes left with the full panel, and one question that's come up as we prepped for this webinar and with some of the questions we're seeing is, when we have these conversations about policy changes and systemic racism, the terms communities of color and Black communities and brown communities and low-income communities tend to get used as if they are the same thing. And I would love any thoughts from the panel about, do we need to actually think about each of these tranches separately when we want to create programs for equitable outcomes, again, specifically within the energy sector? And Fisayo touched on this a little bit with your point that you can't put in equal inputs and expect an equitable outcome because different communities are starting from different places. So John or Diana, particularly, if you have a thought about how we should be thinking about race within the context of energy and designing for equitable outcomes, that would be wonderful.
Diana, why don't you go first and I'll follow you.
Okay, so I mean, I think, you know, as a sociologist, I'm always going to appreciate some kind of differentiation between these terms. I think one of the reasons why they are kind of used interchangeably is because of structural racism. You know, it is sometimes, you know, highly correlated. Low-income status and communities of color, African Americans, Latinos, etc. I wrote a paper with a few colleagues that was published last year, and it was really talking about racial justice, so energy efficiency as a kind of a tool for racial justice, and that would absolutely mean targeting Black communities in this case. Is just to say, like, we have to call that out. There are unique challenges for African Americans in this country, and you know, to a large extent, like, we have to be able to call out, you know, Black disadvantage in a very specific way, because African Americans in this country have suffered disproportionate, you know, like a legacy of racism, like Fisayo was saying, that is steeped into and baked into everything that we understand to be housing and communities. And so, yeah, I think that one positive kind of outcome of the recent protest has been to really just appreciate and call out anti-Black racism. And I think in the energy space, we should do the same.
And I agree with what Dr. Hernández has said, and I'll share a story very briefly. I'm fortunate to work with a Hispanic man every day, and we were having a conversation last week, and he said, John, I have experienced discrimination, but because my skin is light, I recognize that my discrimination may not be as great as that which an African American may experience. So yes, the differences have meaning, and the differences need to be considered as we formulate policies to address them. But I do think that there is something that African Americans and Hispanics share in common, but based on different time horizons. One of the reasons slavery and segregation existed so long is because the way you maximize profits in this country is to have a cheap source of labor. Historically, that was African Americans. Today, it is Hispanics in large part. And so, as an African American, I have a responsibility to strongly support immigration reform and political liberties for Hispanic people, as I also choose to do that. I need to do that with regard to African Americans. And so I think it's important that African Americans and all people recognize that what has happened in this country today on Hispanics who have come to this country is a tragedy, and it needs to be addressed as we simultaneously move forward to address the challenges that have existed in the African American community since the first slaves arrived in 1619.
Thank you, John and Diana. And we're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us today. Dr. Hernández, John Hall, Dana Harmon, Fisayo, Fadelu. Thanks also to the team at Pecan Street, especially Clayton and Josie and Colin for all your help getting this set up and running smoothly. You can sign up if you're not already signed up on the Pecan Street listserv on our website to make sure that you're aware of future webinars that we do on this and other topics. And again, we're going to do our best to get everybody's questions answered after the fact. So also feel free to email us at the media@pecanstreet.org list, that email that's listed here, if you want to add any questions on that weren't submitted through the chat. Thank you everybody for joining us today too. It's a really important conversation. And again, we hope it's just the first of many, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.